Hello and welcome to the Optimising Human Performance podcast. I'm Martin Jones, a human performance specialist, researcher and educator.
And I'm Jonpaul Niven, a former Royal Army Physical Training Corps instructor turned academic. Each week we talk to world-leading experts about how to unlock the full potential of those who operate in high-stress, high-stakes environments.
We discuss the latest science, innovative strategies, practical wisdom and inspirational stories in the rapidly evolving world of human performance optimization.
The Optimising Human Performance podcast is produced in partnership with the Wavell Room and the Tactical Athlete Performance Centre at Buckinghamshire New University.
In this week's episode, we welcome Professor Colin Espie to the podcast. Colin is a professor of sleep medicine in the Nuffield Department of Clinical Neurosciences at the University of Oxford, where he founded the experimental and clinical sleep medicine research program in the Sir Jules Thorne Sleep and Circadian Research Institute. Colin is a world-leading expert on sleep and the treatment of sleep disorders, particularly using cognitive behavioural therapeutics to treat insomnia disorder. Hi, Colin. Welcome to the Optimising Human Performance podcast. It's great to have you with us this evening.
Oh, great to be here, Martin. Great to chat about my favourite subject.
It's my favourite subject as well. I've come to love the topic of sleep over the past few years, so I'm really looking forward to this chat. Can you introduce yourself? Instead of us trying to talk about your many achievements, can you give us an introduction? What do you do at the moment and how have you got to where you are?
Well, by background, I trained as a clinical psychologist working in the mental health area. And over decades, really now, I've come to realise that sleep is probably one of the most important ingredients to protect our mental health and well-being. And for the past 12 years or so, I've been the professor of sleep medicine at the University of Oxford. And my role there is about leading the research drive around understanding sleep and how to improve things when we've got a sleep problem, how to protect our sleep as well as training activities that we do with professionals, not just in the UK, but worldwide, who are keen to understand more about sleep when they see people and they're trying to help them with their day-to-day problems.
Yeah, I've been to your course and I've studied alongside you. And I remember for me, the moment when I realized sleep was so important was trying to understand how to optimize cognitive performance in people in these high reliability roles, these extreme jobs in defense and security. But at what point in your career did you have that light bulb moment where you realized sleep was something that we really need to prioritize and think about?
Well, very, very early on, actually, Martin, because I would see people, say, with depression or with stress or trauma, whatever. And back in those days, and I'm going way back to the 80s, I guess what we generally did was we tried to address what we thought was the main problem, the primary problem. Oh, you're depressed. And therefore, when people weren't sleeping well, we thought, oh, that's a symptom of being depressed, or that's a symptom of stress or whatever. And people educated me, the patients, if you like, educated me and say, well, actually, I think if I could sleep a lot better, I'd be a lot less stressed. If I could get my sleep at night, I don't think I'd be so down during the day. And I began to look into it a bit. I began to do some research myself and realized that there's truly what we call a bi-directional relationship between sleep and our physical and mental health. When we're not well, physically or mentally, we don't sleep so well. But when we don't sleep so well, we're not so well prepared to deal with life. The light bulb moment was probably not so much a moment, but a period of time when I researched this and found out more about it, listened to what people were saying, did some of my own research, and also kind of realized, if you like, sleep is really nature's medicine. Sleep is what nature has provided for us. In spite of being, we imagine, the most highly evolved species, we still absolutely depend on sleep in order to function during the day. So it's a fundamental thing, a bit like we need drinking water, we need oxygen, we need food, we need our sleep.
So a layman's question, why is sleep important? Why is it important from both a physiological perspective, but also from a psychological and cognitive perspective?
There was a very famous researcher back in the 1960s who asked that very same question, why we sleep. And a lot of the studies that have been done to try and understand why we sleep is to look at the consequences to people's function when you deprive them of sleep, either total sleep deprivation or partial sleep deprivations. You get some sleep, but not enough, but also selective sleep deprivation. That is, certain components of sleep are knocked out in the laboratory studies to see what the consequences are. And the consequences are really quite wide-ranging. So what we understand now is that sleep is important for the clearance of metabolic waste. Sleep, for example, is, if you like, the janitor that clears up during the night. And there's a protein, a beta amyloid protein, which may well be implicated in the dementia story, which is selectively cleared at night during sleep. So there's a clearance of neurotoxic waste, if you like, a clearing out and freshening up that takes place. But it's also very important to sleep in order to allow cells to regenerate. So it's often said that a rest is as good as a sleep. Well, a rest is very, very important. And of course, at times when we can't sleep, a rest is crucial. But cells don't regenerate during they only regenerate during sleep. And post-COVID and during COVID as well, people will have been thinking about the importance of control over infection. And this is called an immune system, an immune function. And we also know now that sleep is really, really important for what we call immune signaling. It's a time during which our ability to fight infection is primed. So these are just some examples of physical aspects of recovery that are important in relation to sleep, but also from a cognitive and emotional point of view. Studies show that from a human performance aspect, people's ability to perform routine tasks and complex tasks are compromised when we've not had enough sleep. Although we may actually still feel quite confident that we're doing them well. And this is one of the interesting things, a little bit like when you've had alcohol, you may be impaired in your ability to perform tasks. Other people may notice that, or certainly if you did an objective test, you would see that people were sleepy because we'd be making errors of omission and commission. But you may not realize that you're making those errors because you're kind of a little bit blind to them. So the ability to perform well at tasks is degraded under conditions of lack of sleep, and also our memory, our higher cognitive functions as well. It's a long answer to a question, but it really illustrates the range of ways in which sleep is crucial. A final area to realize is that, and we see this in kids when they're not well slept, that they get cranky, they get irritable. Our emotions are affected when we're not sleeping well. And that could be to become more hyper-aroused, more and more kind of alert, and almost difficult to get down from that position because our brain is kind of figuring out, you're trying to stay awake. Okay, well, let's try and keep you awake then. But you get a bit frazzled. Or it could be that you get actually rather morose and somber and detached, a little bit more on the depressed side. So there's myriad ways in which sleep is absolutely crucial to us. And the research over the past 60, 70 years illustrates that in every department, if you like, sleep is important.
It's real interesting what you were saying there, because I just think back to my own experiences in the military and observing when you've got like a real high operational tempo, certain situational demands dictate certain things have to be achieved, certain objectives, and that's sort of replicated within the training environment as well.
Yes.
And it's sort of accepted that we need to be able to maintain a high up tempo for various reasons. But then at the same time, it's like, well, if we do so, do we have the realization of the potential downstream effects, not only physiological capability, but more importantly, psychological and cognitive capabilities? Because if we start making errors because we're sleep deprived, consequences for high readiness populations, may that be military, police, fire service, could potentially be quite grave. Like we used to have the expression, oh, you're chin strapped, and that came from the term where you're that tired, yet your chin strap of your helmet is essentially the only thing keeping your head up. It's just one of those things like, I wish when I joined the military and in my early career that we paid more attention to this.
I think that there is also a cultural issue there, isn't there? And I'm sure it's not just in the military. I think it's there in business or in high performance situations where to say I'm feeling sleepy or to yawn or to appear not to be able to deal with that is not something that is kind of wanted in those situations. It's almost like you should push through. We should try and manage this situation and almost deny that we're feeling that way. So that can be part of the difficulty that people have. But let me just balance this up a little bit, because although we're a very highly evolved species and we haven't evolved to do without sleep, we need rather a lot. And that's because we've highly evolved brains and therefore we need sleep to be able to function at that level. But also the brain is able to try and figure out what is it you're trying to do, and I'm going to help you with it. So it will recruit an ability to have selective attention to a high danger task, to monitor threat, for example, to manage a situation that's a survival situation. It will focus entirely your energies and your thoughts on that. It will put sleep to the back of your mind, literally, and enable you to deal with that situation because it's of critical importance. But it will only perhaps do that for a period of time. You can't be on high alert like that, for hours and hours on end. The way I often explain this, and Martin will have heard me use this expression before in some of my teaching and training, that we have to bear in mind that our brain is much smarter than we are, because it kind of figures out what needs to happen in this situation and tries to help us deal with it. So, I see, although it's bedtime, it's nighttime, it's dark, that you're feeling sleepy, you're yawning. I can see that you're trying to remain awake. I can see you're dealing with a threatening situation. I'm keeping you alert because threat is risky to you. So I'll help you to monitor that situation and manage that situation. But I've got limits to what I can do for you. Don't over ask, kind of thing. I think that's really quite important. So when we talk about sleep deprivation or sleep loss, or partial sleep deprivation or loss of elements of sleep, we also have to consider for how long it's the person having to deal with this challenging situation. How long can you go without sleep? For some period of time you can, but this is where it's very important that you self-monitor and realize that I've actually had a microsleep there, and you put your hand up and say, I'm really struggling here. So we have to have that fail-safe mechanism. But the brain does try to help us to manage situations that are stressful, and it does so by keeping us alert. And that's a primitive brainstem response, a very primitive brain response to an externally threatening situation.
If someone's in a high threat situation and they're chronically sleep deprived, can that potentially increase their susceptibility to conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder and the like?
Yes, there's a kind of intricate relationship between stressful experiences, the memory and continuing impact of those experiences, and the role that sleep plays in the incubation, if you like, of that stress response from the moment it happens right through to the memory consolidation of it over time. Because one of the functions that sleep has is to help us consolidate memory. Now, there's many studies being done on this. For example, in an experimental context, you give people something to learn. In one group, you give them the opportunity to sleep after that initial learning period. Another group, you keep them awake. And of course, when they're awake, they have the opportunity to keep on rehearsing it. And you might think, well, that's surely going to be the better learning outcome. And it's what students do prior to an exam the next day. But actually, the evidence shows that the group who sleep after learning consolidate that learning better than the group who continue to remain awake, which is a bit counterintuitive, but it relates to my comment earlier that our brain is actually much smarter than us. It doesn't actually need us in a funny kind of way. It gets on with things when we're out the road, and the brain can go on with this task of memory consolidation. There's also studies show that if you have positive stimuli, for example, neutral stimuli and negative stimuli, then during sleep, following sleep deprivation, the brain will consolidate the learning of the negative stimuli because that's more threatening. It will discard the positive stuff in favor of remembering the negative stuff because that's to do with survival. So these are experiments that have been done in laboratories. Now, when you take that to the military situation, people are in critical situations with a lot of important material to learn and remember and to deal with. And they're also engaged in trying not to remember some of this stuff, of course, afterwards, because it was so powerful. But the brain has a need to process emotion. Therefore, it's going to say, we need to understand this. We need to know what's happened to us. We don't want to just eliminate this immediately. We need to process this. In order to process it, we have to remember it. In order to remember it, you need to sleep. So this is the intricate relationship that's still being studied. And there's an open question about whether it's better for people to have a lot of sleep immediately after traumatic experiences, or actually to taper that in over time and not to just get off duty out of a situation, great, let's sleep now. That could be actually making things temporarily worse. It might be better to gradually get back into your sleep pattern rather than to immediately go from no sleep to loads of sleep, because that could be the worst situation for consolidating post-traumatic stress. But we don't know for sure yet. And it's one of the reasons that I think a lot of us are interested in understanding more about how sleep relates to trauma or negative images and so on, not just in laboratory experiments, but in real world situations, for example, the military.
No, real interesting. Thank you.
Just looping back to a bit earlier when we were talking about what happens when you don't get enough sleep. There's this group of people that I'm sure you're aware of, this idea of a sleepless elite. These people who seemingly get by with very little sleep and attribute their success to that ability to operate sleep deprived or sleep restricted. Do they exist? What are your thoughts on this concept of a sleepless elite?
I think one of the things to recognize is that we all have a need for a certain amount of sleep, but that certain amount of sleep may vary from person to person. And it's not a matter of weakness that you may be somebody who actually requires a little bit more sleep than somebody else. That's simply an individual difference. And the analogy I often give here is because people think, well, how much sleep do I actually need? I'm a 45-year-old man. How much sleep do I need? And you think you just read it off a graph. So we can talk about average requirements for sleep. And of course, you can always work out an average. But by definition of an average, 50% of the population is below average and 50% is above average in terms of any characteristic, whether it's height, weight, shoe size. That you really have to try and find out what's the comfort fit for the sleep that you need, in the same way as you would try on shoes for size. And even if you knew what your shoe size was, it doesn't mean that you would not bother trying on shoes when you went to the shoe shop. You would still try them on, because it's about getting it not just roughly right, it's getting it comfort right. So therefore, it isn't a smart idea to will yourself into some idea of you're an elite sleeper. The smart thing to do is to figure out how much sleep you actually need and to make sure you get that amount of sleep that you need. And I think the risk is that people will strive towards something that isn't actually healthy or is not likely to be successful for them. It's much better to work with individual differences and value them than it is to try and make everyone stamped from exactly the same mold. And that can be difficult in industry, it can be difficult in shift work, it can be difficult, I'm sure, in the military. But if you think about another characteristic that relates to our sleep, which is the timing of our sleep, we know very well that there are people who are more natural night owls, another group of people maybe more natural morning people or larks. And that's an adaptive, helpful thing if we value the fact that these are individual differences. Whereas if we say, well, we're not interested in people having individual differences and needing this amount of sleep versus that amount, or being a night owl versus a morning person, we actually want to pretend everyone is the same, and we want to try and convert everyone to being exactly the same. That is folly, I think. And there will be a few people, of course, Martin, there will be some people who don't need as much sleep as others, just in the same way as people who get smaller or larger feet. But it's not to their credit. It's the feet they were born with.
Yeah. I often get the question that effectively, let's say I need 10 hours, but I've got this belief that if I only sleep for 4 hours, that means I'm awake for 20 and I can be more productive. So we can throw that out the window, right? If I'm going to halve the amount of sleep or even more than halve the amount of sleep, that's not going to improve my performance. It's going to be a detrimental. I'm getting that right?
Yes. I mean, I think there is this idea in society in general, in high performing situations, and it happens with senior executives who, to be honest, get burnt out actually rather quickly and become rather somewhat expendable in that business situation, because treating hours asleep as hours off duty, downtime is wasted time or could be spent more valuably, that almost sleep is not productive. And I think we need to try and challenge that and think, well, actually, the productive time is sleep. During the daytime, you're expending energy, you're diminishing your capability the longer you're awake in order to need restored, if you like, to get back to good functioning for the next day. So sleep is the restorer. Sleep is what enables us to be productive. It's not something that's unproductive. It's an enabler of productivity. Again, I think being able to challenge this with evidence is really, really important. Bring the science into this. It's not a matter of opinion at the end of the day. You could challenge the average person to hold their breath, right? And some people would hold their breath for maybe 2.5 minutes, but they're not going to do it for very long because you can't do without it. So we need to do some experiments there in the real world to help people recognize that it's not a flaw, if you like, it's a strength. It's a natural biological drive, it's a need, it's an empowering of the individual's capability. And people will make better and wiser decisions when they've had as much sleep as they possibly can get. And I realize in many situations, it's not possible to get all of the sleep that you require. And I think the brain does help compensate for that. But I think the wise thing to do would be to say, well, can we keep those periods of time when people have to be awake or have to be on duty, can we keep those relatively limited? and not become a chronic problem and allow people time to recover, to rest, to recuperate, and get back to their best self, if you like.
Colin, when I was researching for this episode, so I came across your short report in the Journal of Sleep Research on the 5 principles of sleep. Could you just take us through that piece of work?
Yeah, so the 5 principles of sleep health arose just as a way of explaining the importance of sleep to the general public during COVID. And I was doing some work with Public Health England, and they wanted to incorporate it into their mental well-being plan. How do you get a good night's sleep? And of course, if you search on the web about getting a good night's sleep, what you mostly find is don't drink too much coffee, get a comfortable bed, all these things. Now, there's nothing wrong with those things, but it didn't really seem to be the key message we should be trying to give to people. If you think about the animal kingdom, for example, they don't sleep well because they don't drink coffee. They don't sleep well because they've got a certain tog of duvet. These are not the reasons that people are sleeping well either. But even more so because when people struggle with sleep, they're desperate to find a solution. And then they Google it and they find these things like caffeine and exercise and all that stuff, which is important. And they think, I'm already doing all that. I don't even drink coffee. And so they're not finding a solution. So the 5 principles of sleep health, I'll just summarize briefly what they are. First of all, it's about valuing sleep. That sleep is to be something that is valued. And if you think about what is it you value in your life? You value your independence, you value your family, your children, you value your relationships, your team, whatever. So I think it's about understanding that sleep is a fundamental commodity. It's not a nice to have, although it is nice to have it. It's a need to have. So the beginnings of sleep health is understanding that sleep is not an optional extra. It's not I'll take it when I can get it. It's something that has to be the core of my life. In the same way as you would never contemplate doing without food. You'd never contemplate trying to live in an environment where there was no oxygen because you wouldn't survive. So it's fundamentally seeing its value. And then the second principle is about, because you value it, you prioritize it. You put your kids first. You put your family first, or the things that you value first. So prioritizing it then from a public health point of view is to, how do I make sure that I get sufficient sleep in order to be able to function well? And that sometimes means making decisions in our day-to-day lives, which means, sorry guys, I need to head off, I need to get my sleep. Spoiler at the party, whatever it happens to be. It's about prioritizing it, not just in my head I prioritize it, in my behavior I prioritize it. And that's sometimes where leadership comes in as well, by demonstrating to other people that it's not a weakness to be hungry, it's not a weakness to be thirsty, it's not a weakness to need to sleep. I think in some ways we are still pack animals and we need a leader. And the leader's going to take us to survival. It's going to take us to food, water, shelter. Is the leader not going to take us to good sleep, recovery? Is the leader going to allow us to be vulnerable, sleep deprived and at risk? I've been in that situation before, advising leadership groups around this, where often there is a culture, and I'm not talking about the military, but in business circles, they say, well, we fly our people first class. That's how we invest in people. And therefore, if we're paying that money, we expect them to be sharp because we've paid for that. You say, well, that's not actually how you show leadership in this situation, because we're not adapted to international travel quite like that, and you can't buy it. You've got to invest in people in a different kind of way. So I think there's a cultural aspect to organizations as well that then permits people to find their ways of dealing with situations and comes up with resources and solutions for them. Shift patterns, deployment patterns, rest patterns, recovery patterns, etc. Because if you were to ask me, what is the one big investment organizations, teams could make that would make a difference to peak performance, it would be about make sure your team is well rested, well slept, and is performing well. The third principle is recognizing that we need to personalize our sleep, that we're not clones of each other, and we should celebrate individual differences. And it's a process of discovery to find out, how do I personalize my sleep? There's no credit to being the person who actually requires a bit less sleep than somebody else. You don't deserve that. That just happens to be the case. You might not need as much sleep as somebody else. And likewise, somebody who's more naturally a morning person, more naturally a nighttime person. I often say to people, how can you have got to 40 years of age and you don't know yourself? How long is it going to take for you to know yourself. And part of knowing yourself is about knowing your habits, your needs, your requirements. And that's about personalizing your sleep. And if people aren't sure how to do that, then it's a matter of trial and error. You try things out, because sometimes we're anxious to stick exactly where we are at the moment, rather than saying, well, maybe I've not got it quite right. Maybe I should be trying to get to bed a bit earlier. Maybe I would waken early because I'm a morning person. So therefore, maybe I sometimes need to go to bed a bit earlier, or adapt in a more personal way to a circumstance. So valuing, prioritizing, personalizing, and then crucially trusting. Trusting sleep is really, really important, because in 40 odd years, I've never met a single person who could get to sleep. I've only ever met people who can fall asleep. I've never met a good breather who can breathe well by trying to breathe better. It only makes you more preoccupied. And there's so much, this conversation we're having just now, for example, we're speaking, I hope, reasonably fluently, but we're doing that because the brain is kind of allowing it to happen. It's flowing. We're not in control of it. We can see each other because we've got the cameras on. We can hear each other because we're listening. But it doesn't mean we're good at listening or good at seeing. It just kind of happens, right? And therefore, sleep is something that we need to trust to happen. And paradoxically, if you try to get to sleep and you get preoccupied with it, you're not actually trusting it to happen, then you'll end up remaining awake. So trust is really important, that will get in its pattern if you personalize it, allow it to happen, and it will come when it's ready. And lastly, beyond valuing, prioritizing, personalizing, and trusting your sleep, we need to protect it. Whatever you value, you will protect with your life if need be. So how do you protect your sleep? And one way in which you might protect it is by being willing to speak out loud and say sometimes, sorry guys, I'm tired, I'm sleepy. And that shows some leadership, and it protects it, but it's also about protecting it from the invasion of negative thoughts and the invasion of the restless mind. So trying to put the day to rest, for example, before you go to bed, try and work through things, sort them out and close the book in the day. Very simple things that you might teach your children to say, right, it's time to go to bed. Let's put that aside. Let's have a nice, quiet environment. Let's have a routine. In some ways, we're still children. We still require that protection.
No, that's a brilliant summary there.
That's awesome. Can we talk about insomnia? You mentioned you've treated insomnia. You've written the books. You're well versed on insomnia. First and foremost, what are we talking about? What is insomnia? And then how do we help people who are suffering?
Well, insomnia is simply an extension of something that everyone has experienced. Everyone has had a bad night of sleep, and everyone knows, even if that's all happened very occasionally, how miserable that can be when you can't get to sleep. You can't get back to sleep, or you're waking up very early in the morning. Your sleep is curtailed. So everyone has experienced that. But insomnia is that happening on a regular basis. Usually we talk about 3 or more nights per week for a period of about 3 months. So more often than not, you're not sleeping well, and it's become like a chronic pattern. So insomnia is not just a situational poor night of sleep that everyone kind of understands, and it's accounted by something that's happening the next day or something. Because in those circumstances, if you have a bad night's sleep, typically you will sleep better the next night. There's what we call a homeostatic drive. If you're deprived of water, you become thirsty. If you're deprived of food, you become hungry. If you're deprived of sleep, you become sleepier and you recover the next night or soon afterwards. So it's really more a pattern where it's not recovering and you're getting more bad than good, and it's ending up getting into chronic difficulty, not just for the nights themselves, but also for the functional consequences in your day-to-day quality of life, whether that's in terms of your mental health, emotional well-being, or your cognitive health, your ability to function. And people typically look for help when they're having both difficulties at night and during the day. And the example I often give people to help understand what I mean by the functional consequences is to consider the situation where you've broken your leg and you go to the emergency department. Of course you do. So why are you going there? And you say, I'm going there because I've broken my leg. I say, well, that's not why you went, is it? You went because you couldn't walk. It's the functional consequence that helps people to see that this is now serious. You know, up until then, you might hobble along, literally. So that's a long answer to the question, but I think it's an important differentiation that it's an extension of a normal experience. Just like depression, everyone has felt down, sad, low, maybe even really low from time to time, but it's a passing thing, it's a momentary thing. Depression is a prevailing feeling of misery, and it invades your life. Insomnia is not something that people are unfamiliar with. It's something that becomes more like a medical or clinical problem when it becomes that relentless, chronic problem of not being able to sleep at night and not being able to function as well as you should during the day.
Mm. So when people are coming to you with this persistent problem with initiating sleep or maintaining sleep or early morning awake, what can we do to help these people? What are the treatment options for individuals who are suffering?
Yes, right. So the treatment options, broadly speaking, are pharmacological, taking a medicine of some kind. And most medicines in this category are sedative kind of medicines. So they're designed to try and shut down the nervous system. They don't tend to promote natural or normal sleep. They tend to interfere with sleep to some degree. But sleeping pills have been around for millennia, probably of different kinds. And of course, pharmaceutical grade sleeping pills have been around for decades and decades. That's one approach. But actually, most people would prefer not to use medication to help themselves sleep, particularly if it's a chronic difficulty, Martin, because then you think, well, how long am I going to have to take pills for? And a lot of these pills are really only effective over the course of a few nights, and most of them are not recommended to be taken beyond a week or so. And doctors themselves are not keen to give people pills for sleep. Then the other approach is what's called cognitive behavioural therapy. And cognitive behavioural therapy does really two things, and it says it on the tin, if you like. The cognitive bit helps people to deal with and overcome this racing mind phenomenon that they experience as a causal thing. I can't sleep because my mind's racing. It gives people tools to address that. And the behavioural piece is really about your pattern, getting your sleep back into a routine. Now, we can talk a little bit about what these techniques might be in a moment, but let me just say that it's quite commonly misunderstood that a pill is going to be a biological treatment and have its means of action through changing your biology or addressing your biology. And CBT is a kind of psychological treatment dealing simply with changing your mind at some level. I think that's kind of an incorrect way of thinking about it, because cognitive behavioral therapy has a very direct impact on your biology as well. Because as soon as you begin to change your behavior, sleep pattern, you're affecting the way your sleep expresses itself. And we begin to affect our sleep drive and the timing of our sleep. And we can tune that up to be not just better psychologically, but better biologically. And likewise, if a sleeping pill is like a sedative to help us down-regulate our arousal level, to take stress levels down, there are also cognitive techniques that do the same and help to de-escalate tension, stress, and so on, and have a very distinctive relaxation effect, which is measurable physiologically. So CBT is not just some kind of psychobabble, some kind of therapy for weak minds. It's actually a very powerful psychobiological treatment that affects our actual ability to sleep.
Can I just ask, where does alcohol fit? I know in the UK, there's a concept of a nightcap, and I've had people talk to me about that. That's part of their sleep routine. It helps them get to sleep. Where are you on alcohol as a sleep aid?
Yeah, well, part of the difficulty here, of course, is that it is actually quite effective in the short term. So some of the sleeping pills act very similarly to alcohol. Alcohol is a sedative drug, and it does reduce muscle tone. It is a relaxant. It does have effects in terms of down-regulating the arousal system. It numbs the senses. And in extreme doses, of course, it actually literally causes you to be unconscious. Of course, a lot of people have either by hook or by crook discovered this. And sometimes people are in the habit of taking some alcohol in order to help themselves sleep. But it's a very short-term solution to a problem that's become chronic. Because like anything, you need to increase the dose to get the same effect over time, and that can be a dangerous thing to do. Alcohol also suppresses a component of our sleep that people will probably be familiar with called REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. It tends to abolish rapid eye movement sleep in the early part of the night. This is one of the ways in which it stops your sleep being normal. But as the alcohol wears off in your system during the night, you're likely to have what's called a rebound in the REM sleep. And this is dreaming type sleep towards morning. And sometimes those dreams can become more disturbed, even nightmarish, in people who are drinking regularly or too much. What it shows us in a way, though, Martin, is that people are trying to find their own solution. If you like, alcohol is a self-help solution. I'm doing this privately in my own living room. I'm trying to fix this problem myself. And in some ways, that's admirable that people should be trying to solve the problem themselves. But this is actually what cognitive behavioral therapy does as well. It is a way of learning skills that you can use in your own environment. It's about empowering people to solve the problem themselves, but not necessarily by using alcohol.
Colin, in certain high readiness organisations, a term often uses sleep banking. Obviously, people trying to get additional sleep before they go into certain operational roles.
Well, there is some experimental evidence that you can bank a certain amount of sleep. It's a short-term investment in the bank. If something is immediately coming up, then it may assist you on that night or the subsequent night. It's not something like you can do for a few days or a week or a fortnight kind of thing. It's something that might short-term help. A little bit like if somebody is a pearl diver, they will hyperventilate in order to oxygenate the blood. So it helps you make that 2.5 minute pearl dive, a 3.5 minute or 4 minute pearl dive or whatever. But it doesn't help you much beyond 3 minutes, right? It's a short-term benefit. It's worth considering because some situations are unavoidable where people are going to be sleep deprived. It has to be done thoughtfully, though. And bear in mind, too, you can't just sleep at will. So although you may give people the opportunity to bank some sleep, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to sleep. But it's worth considering, the sleep banking piece, and I think should be perhaps thoughtfully introduced into people's routines.
Just sort of expanding upon that further, in certain organisations, there's a belief that you can conduct sleep deprivation training, and that's going to improve your ability to operate while sleep deprived.
My thoughts on that would be that if you train yourself under sleep deprivation, then you should train yourself in doing so to recognise sleep deprivation and to know when you are sleep deprived. That's probably the principal advantage of it, to realise the vulnerability associated with insufficient sleep, rather than to see it as some kind of inoculation that's going on. It's more raising awareness, I think, would be very, very valuable. So you know what it's like to feel sleep deprived. You become familiar with it and you know what steps to take to try to address it, manage it, and where possible to mitigate it. But it's not some kind of exposure therapy that I've now overcome this problem. I've been trained in this, so I no longer have it. That would be a rather risky perspective to take. I think one should be very respectful of the impact that sleep deprivation has on us and mindful that when it's happening and retain that awareness rather than becoming more blasé about it. I think also there's a lot to be said for training people to do things well under optimal conditions so that you can apply them in difficult situations rather than learn to do them in the most difficult situations. Because I think there's what we tend to call in science a sensitivity specificity problem here, that you may be throwing babies out with bathwater by setting a challenge that is so difficult for most people that you've lost a lot of talent, a lot of skill, a lot of capability in some individuals by simply placing the, if you like, the fault line in the wrong position. What if people under optimal conditions can't perform well? Is that surely not an equally, if not more important thing? So I think it's important that people understand the amount of sleep, the timing of sleep, the nature of sleep deprivation, and raise awareness and discussion about it. In the airline industry, I think we can see there that there's been a development of a lot of euphemistic language, that nobody actually talks about feeling sleepy. Nobody talks about being sleep deprived. They all talk about fatigue management. It's a little bit of denial of the truth, to my mind, because when you're fatigued, you can usually overcome fatigue by behavioural activation. You can get up and do stuff and you keep yourself busy, occupied, and you can get yourself out of a sense of tiredness and fatigue. Whereas when you're actually sleepy, activation like that is much less effective. And actually what you'd be better to do is to find protocols where people can be permitted short naps, because the solution to sleep deprivation is doses of sleep. It's not willpower. So therefore the differentiation, I think, between fatigue and sleepiness is really quite a crucial one. And I think that's sometimes overlooked. I'm not sure exactly what happens in the military situation there, but it's certainly something I've discussed with the airline industry on a number of occasions. Because what pilots need when they're off duty in long-haul flights is not rest. They need sleep to offset the sleep loss they're experiencing. They need bits of both.
Brilliant. The point on self-awareness and just people being aware of being tired, but then more importantly, how does it impact upon them? That self-reflection, that sort of inner monologue to realise what it could potentially mean, because far too often I think, especially military cultures, that macho environment, just crack on, I can deal with this. But the consequences of not operating at your optimal capability, as we've discussed today, can be quite grave.
It's interesting, the fatigue countermeasure idea. What I always talk to people about is that none of those countermeasures will overcome the need to sleep. If you have the opportunity to sleep, you should do. You don't use these countermeasures in place of sleep.
Yeah, so if we take a civilian example of that, Martin, if you fall asleep at the wheel when you're driving, you will be convicted, potentially imprisoned, on the same basis as if you were driving when drunk. The highway code clearly says you've got to be aware, you've got to be responsible, you're accountable for being fit to drive. So the countermeasures that people sometimes use when driving, when sleepy, and people know they've done this, we've all done it, driven on a bend and thought, oh my goodness, I hit the rumble strip there. It takes a second or two to drive off a bend, off a motorway, 70 miles an hour. And the countermeasures that people are constantly telling us they've been using don't work. I opened the window, I put the music up loud, I pinched myself. People bite their lips, they bite into their fingers, they try and do all kinds of things to try and keep themselves awake. Now, these countermeasures might work in relation to fatigue or tiredness. They do not work in relation to sleepiness. What the highway code tells you need to do is come off the motorway at the safest point, have a caffeinated drink, and then have a brief nap. Why have a caffeinated drink? Because that boosts alertness. The caffeine takes some time to kick in. The nap kicks in immediately. So if you have a 5 to 10 minute nap, you will actually feel quite restored after a brief nap. The caffeine will then kick in, and you've actually affected your journey by 10 to 15 minutes, but you've made it much more probable that you will complete your journey safely and you will not kill anyone else on the road. It's as simple as that. We have a tool to use, which is the nap. A nap doesn't mean I'm going to sleep for an hour. You can get a lot of restoration out of a brief nap of 10 minutes or so.
The most shocking technique I've heard of was sharpening a stick and jabbing it into a leg. I'm not sure that worked either. Can we go back to the CBTI techniques that you mentioned about how to treat people who are suffering with these insomnia symptoms or insomnia disorders?
Mm-hmm.
How do we do it? So what are the actual things that comprise this therapy, this umbrella term of what CBTI is?
Right. So I'll let you into a secret. It's not a secret, but an insight. That the active ingredient in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, the active ingredient is sleep. What CBT does is corral your sleep in such a way that it actually becomes potent and influential in your life again and begins to direct you rather than you trying to, if you like, initiate it. So if we take the behavioral piece first, the B in CBT, there's a technique that we commonly recommend people use, which is called sleep restriction therapy. Now, you're not actually restricting your sleep. It's a bit of a misnomer. You're restricting the time during which you're going to allow yourself to sleep. And the analogy I often give people here is of my grandmother's knitting, that old sweater that was overworn and was full of holes, that the raw material was actually perfectly fine. And she proved that to you when she tore it out and knitted it back into a jumper for you with an extra bit in it because you'd grown. But the point is you could take the raw material and stitch it back together tightly. Now, what happens in insomnia is because people have not been sleeping well, they generally tend to spend more time in bed to try and catch up because they're getting insufficient sleep. So what we do in sleep restriction therapy is say, how much sleep are you actually getting? And they say, well, I'm only getting 5 hours or 6 hours or whatever it happens to be. I'm in bed for 7 or 8. And I say, well, that's the problem. You're not going to sleep 7 or 8 hours by trying to sleep an extra 2 or 3 lying awake in bed because your sleep pattern is fragmented. It's like an old sweater that's out of shape. We need to rip the material out and say, how much raw material is there? Okay, there's 5 hours or 6 hours. Go to bed for 5 or 6 hours. And say, well, I'm not going to sleep through that. And he said, well, it's not working at the moment, is it? So why don't you try this experiment for a period of time, going to bed for a shorter duration? And what tends to happen in those circumstances when people are staying up later, getting up early in the morning, doing that 7 days a week, is they begin to find really quite quickly that they sleep through that shorter window. And they begin to say things to me like, see, I said I was going to stay up till 12:30 and then get up at 6 in the morning. I'm really struggling to stay awake till 12:30. And see, when I'm getting up, I've had to set an alarm now to get up at that time. Because what they're finding is that their sleep is filling the available time period that you're making for them. And because it's consolidated sleep, it's wanting to push out beyond those boundaries. Like grand sweater, it's stretchy again. And then you can say, okay, go to bed a little bit longer and see if you can sleep a little bit longer. And then you gradually tease it out. We talked earlier on about personalizing your sleep. You find out what is the amount of sleep that I actually need. And when is the best time for me? I actually get my sleep better if I go to bed early and accept that I got up awake at 5 in the morning. I'm a bit of a morning person. Or actually, I'm better if I go to bed a bit later because I'm a bit of a night owl and I sleep on a bit later. So that's one example of a behavioral technique. But you'll see from that example, Martin, that this is why I'm saying that cognitive behavioral therapy is not just some form of psychology for the mind. It's actually about reshaping your biological sleep drive and using that to become dominant again and trusting it to happen. You're not becoming a good sleeper in the sense of being good at sleeping. What you're actually doing is you're enabling sleep to take control again. And of course, the good sleeper doesn't claim any special skill. They don't know how they do it. Right? And that really takes us to the C bit. If I give you one example of a cognitive technique, that actually, when we're engaged with an insomnia problem, it becomes a little bit like a performance anxiety. That's the term that we sometimes use. And I give you other examples of natural phenomena that are affected by overthinking them. The human sexual response is one. Typically, there's nothing wrong with the apparatus. But if people think there is something wrong, they try to perform, and they're overthinking it, then they won't perform. Stuttering and stammering is a lot to do with self-monitoring too much and trying to speak fluently, trying not to make a mistake. Better not make a mistake, better not make a mistake. An intention tremor, a bit the same. I better not shake, I better not drop this. I better not blush. Blushing was the worst thing possibly to happen. And even in more everyday mundane things, like in sports, there's a fine line between being prepared and accurate and trying to drive the ball too deliberately down the middle and have the worst slice ever. And the best way to reverse the psychology is actually by trying to remain awake when you feel sleepy. Not thinking, here we go, boys, we're about to fall asleep. Oh, that's me awake again. It's about saying, I'm feeling a bit sleepy now. I'm feeling a bit sleepy. Let's stay awake for another second, keep my eyes open for a few seconds longer. And what you begin to experience when you reverse the psychology like that is you realize that you're removing psychology out of the way and you're allowing the sleep drive to express itself. And then people realize that they can fall asleep involuntarily. They're falling asleep without trying to fall asleep. And that's when they realize I don't need to overthink this anymore because I fall asleep even when I try to stay awake. So there's a lot more to it in terms of the nuance, but broadly speaking, what we're doing with cognitive behavioral therapy is setting a pattern that's adaptive to allow sleep to deliver its best self to us by filling available gaps, allowing them to stretch out to where we need them to be, initially constraining them, and then reversing our anxiety and effort to sleep by allowing ourselves to fall asleep naturally again, by tempting ourselves to remain awake. So these are just some examples of many, many different things that are in the cognitive and behavioral therapy toolbox, if you like, all of which are really designed to allow sleep to express itself the way it does for a good sleeper, rather than to become an expert tightrope walker, that you're now an expert sleeper. That's never going to be good for anyone, and that's not what good sleepers do.
That's great. That's a great way of describing it. You always come up with good ways of describing these things, so that was awesome. Colin, we've taken a lot of your time, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this. It's been a real masterclass on sleep and how to manage it. What we like to do is to hand it over to you for the final word and just to give you that opportunity to talk about anything that we've not talked about yet, or to reinforce anything that's particularly relevant or important to you. So over to you for the final words.
Well, I mean, I would just rehearse a little bit what I said earlier on. Good sleep health is within everyone's grasp. It really is about understanding that this is something very valuable and precious. It's there for us. Sometimes we need to tempt it to express its best self for us. But it'll struggle to do that unless it thinks we're giving it attention. When you value something, you prioritize it. When you prioritize it, then you respect it. And also respect the fact that this is something we need to personalize to get right for us. Don't try to be somebody else. Personalize your sleep and learn to trust it. And the CBT thing, above all, is about trust. It's about not trying to become or overcome. It's not about striving. It's not about winning, defeating the enemy, if you like. It's about embracing something that's natural and that wants to deliver for us. But we need to provide the parameters that it's going to work best for us. And once we've got it in good shape, to protect it. And listen, a lot of this is easily said because I know a lot of people struggle with sleep problems. Some of them are like insomnia, some of them are most post-traumatic things. These are very, very difficult things to live with. But the cognitive behavioural approach has been shown to be very, very effective, even if it takes a little bit of time. And if you've had a difficulty sleeping for months or years, then it is worth spending some days and weeks getting it right and not getting impatient, not getting hopeless or helpless that, this isn't working. Sometimes we're in a bad sleep habit. We need to get back into a good sleep habit. Trust yourself to be able to do that. And I'm sure you're going to sleep a lot better than you were before. And if you're already a good sleeper, then appreciate it, have high regard for it and maintain it that way.
Fantastic.
Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. I did say that I'd give you the final word, but the final word is, how can people contact you? Where do they find out more about the excellent work you're doing and the services that you provide?
At Oxford, where I work, we try to make ourselves available for teaching and training. I guess primarily we're trying to figure out ways that are going to help as many people as possible. And that isn't always by just forming an orderly queue at my door, because that can be a very inefficient way of helping people. So what I'm trying to do is train as many people as possible to become good sleep professionals, sleep clinicians, so we can help other people by working with organizations as well as individuals. We're doing work at the moment, for example, looking at shift work in doctors and nurses, working with systems as well as with individuals. We put resources online through Oxford. Also, I'm on Twitter, or X as it is now, and put resources up there from time to time. And there's also some self-help materials and books and so on that you can make available to people.
But yeah, I'll definitely put this in the show notes so everyone can access the excellent books. Thank you, Colin, again. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on the Optimising Human Performance podcast, a Wavell Room production. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to like and subscribe so that we can keep improving. And remember to visit wavellroom.com to find their latest articles, podcasts, and newsletters.
If you know someone who could benefit from our discussions, please refer them to our show. Your recommendation is our highest compliment.